Welcome to the Solomon Show. This episode 17, my last prayer to violence.
I feel I've spent my whole life avoiding violence. Agents of violence were always present. Alcoholics, abusers, sexual predators, cops, unmedicated mentally ill adults who believe in teaching children to cry quietly, animals in despair chewing on each other's legs, small town abusers and grifters, crabs in a bucket, animals who were taught to obey through violence, animals taught to teach through violence, internalizing the violence as a tool of fearful obedience, taught through fear and through the teachings of moral conclusions, anything and everything that's believable. They teach through scars, and we learn to avoid the pain. It's not all malicious intent or unconscionable plots of ill will. Some of us seek out the wounded, finding value in the intimacy of shared trauma. Some behavioral patterns, like what I experienced, were symptoms of poverty and a lack of mental health access. The only trickle-down you'll experience in the United States is trauma. Conversely, some authority positions are sought out of fear and illusions of control. So those of us wounded and incapable of hierarchical evaluation become their enemies. Otherness built and maintained in the mind and social lexicon. Maybe aware of the hyperbole in the beginning, but eventually lost in the lexicon of indoctrination through criminal narratives. Ambiguous rhetoric with spotlighted scapegoats. Violence becomes moral and virtuous. Miseducated men and women get hurt. Learn and internalize destructive patterns. They need to explain why they got hurt, so they hurt others. Build narratives to normalize, calling the ebb and flow, law and order, family, romance, politics, or unregulated markets. Deep generational patterns are hard to crack. Sometimes we develop adverse patterns, reactionary lifestyle that becomes our identity. I feel like this is where I learned self-preservation techniques, which in time developed into terminal skepticism, corrupted value systems, and mental health issues. And I feel isolated when folks are present or not. I feel compelled to avoid folks. The isolation makes my mental health worse. Skepticism is kind of the only logical bit of it. There's no on or off switch. I believe everyone, whether conscious or not, has ill intent, some kind of grift. I use the word believe because it's a term of faith that proves itself when it needs to prove itself. We've internalized predatory value systems in personal relationships, and I feel that to be true. No evidence until I inevitably experience miscommunication. It complicates a basic part of a healthy relationship. Expectation, failure, then a highway access to pain and past trauma, making connections that aren't there. The flood hits, the fear hits. My brain says, remember the violence. They'll hurt you if you let them. I'm wincing or barking or feeling exposed or exploited, waiting for the humiliation, the name-calling, thrown objects, fists, knives, baseball bats, the door to bust open, the screaming, the slamming cabinets, the howls of tears, screeching cries, fists through walls, fists through windows, glass shattering. Scratches, nails in the flesh, metal on metal, wood on wood, shotgun blast, pistol pop, the deafening ring, or a partner to crash the car into yours, then speed off down the road. I've seen, felt, fawned, and feigned so much violence. So much I won't speak of here. When I was young, real young, I tried to make myself small so no one would direct their wrath or grift at me. I'm 6'5". It was impossible to be small past puberty. I tried. I do this to this day, I believe. Quiet, disconnected, living on a piece of paper in my albums, a book, or in a TV screen. Avoiding violence. In a blank piece of paper, film narrative, book plot, characters, ethos, comics or abstractions, I learned to deconstruct, observe, and build safe spaces of creativity. I swore to myself when I grew up, I would be a different type of adult. Someone who could protect my mother and other kids, and in general, a loose montage of a good man. A version of my father who could stay out of prison and protect his son, display some kind of tender grace and unchallenged strength, learned deeply from his violent mistakes, quelled rage for the austerity of love and family. I didn't want to be chained to a table like him. Same room every other Saturday. I didn't want to talk to my child through a few inches of glass. I didn't want to be taking Polaroids of my family in a cold visitation yard, asking Granny for change to buy a soda. I didn't want to raise my future children through handwritten letters. Normal to me, but ultimately kept me in a different category in every aspect of my life as a child. From the tension to the bubbling, to the burst of violence, to serving hard time, to the screaming, fighting, and drunken throaty barks of broken men, I was developing and learning to weave through it all, burying a portion of myself alive in my penwork and drawings. A secret self unscathed by the punitive storm where a portion of my family lived. I was 15, 16 when my father was on the front page of the local newspaper for murder, and I couldn't hang out with some of my friends anymore. Artsy isolated became extremely isolated. A few friends helped as much as they could. Some were mean, unequipped to aid or care. I dealt with abuse at home, homelessness, and all the other slimy bits of children coming of age in poverty and violence. I pushed through and survived, graduated homeless, gave my degree to a friend's mom in the crowd, and never looked at it again. I only graduated because they threatened to put me in jail. It meant nothing. They were trying to teach me a lesson about obedience. When I got older, I pretended to be bigger than the violence I experienced. The cold systemic lessons of obedience or profitable internment. Pretended to be bigger than the blunt trauma, the hunger, the hurt. I pretended for years I was bigger. Till one day, I was. And then I pretended I was safe behind a stoic slouch. And eventually I was. So familiar with all these awful forms of miscommunication, harm, destruction, and malicious intent, I felt like I finally had a view of what I had experienced, could process it, and finally go with the rage. What I didn't realize was, as long as I thought I could swell to the volume of needed violence, I was going to continue generational patterns of violence. Violence is a break in the lexicon. All ethical infrastructure and communication shattered, and new lexicons ensure equality and paths of progress and mobility. Violence can't be in our lexicons, less for mortal self-defense. That's a tall order. Asking hurt folks who were taught to consume and believe to build independent inventories of abstractions they use and implement into non-violent behavioral patterns. Everything inside me screams, don't let these hurt animals touch you again. And I can imagine and empathize how others feel. I know I've been violent myself, verbally out of pocket when someone was being violent towards me. I know I participated and helped build what I thought was a nonviolent lexicon, but what I didn't realize was these things move as they should. We all should be listening and keeping up perpetual dialogue and internalizing new parameters, language, experience, and context to share for the overall progress of our culture. But it's hard to see the scope of it when you're fighting to survive. Even harder to see the system, predatory in nature, owns every measure of value and time. Before I was 18, I'd seen cops beat family members while they were handcuffed. I had seen family men beat women, children kick dogs, and everything in between. I saw despair in women turn into addiction. I saw abusive relationships decline over years to total destruction and imprisonment. I saw the children in my family struggle. We had to organize ourselves just to survive the adults around us. It all trickles down, decades, generations, lexicons, tradition, violence. I still hear shouting and crying when I close my eyes sometimes. Sometimes I feel sudden, unexplained terror that someone's going to kick in the door and start hitting me. It's illogical. I can't explain. I don't talk about it because it causes others' pain and social discomfort. There's no immediate threat, but the sound of any sudden noise or volume increase, and I'm in a hot white heat of terror. Embers in my chest. Since I grew up the way I did, terror becomes vigilant engagement to survive. I'm not looking to absolve my guilt of the times I was verbally violent. No one can get between me and my narrative, which is bleak and morose most days. I've said things in black outrage that will echo throughout time and space as pure idiocy, not even knowing what I said, but being told afterwards. A feeling hard to describe other than torrential shame. The days, weeks, months, and years afterwards of daily inventory, questioning whether I was now the violent animal who hurt others. I spend every day moving away from the weakest moments of my character and loss of paideia, creating an in-depth inventory, helping others and listening. The final conclusion after years of self-punishing, our punitive nature conceals paths to healing. We need paths to sustainable, non-violent future. And I had to think about the most violent men I knew growing up and why they did what they did, why they find violence to be the tool that works on all problems. And I've typed it, said it, sang it, wrote it in poem, lyric, spoken word. And all you got is a hammer. Everything looks like a nail. Where did it all come from? Like, how does it stop? Who's inspired to change if there's no path to rehabilitation, no path to equity, no inclusion in the left or right binary, no way to correct your behavioral patterns outside of punitive slavery, no space for abusive cycle breaks, no alternative narratives to the inevitable abuse begets isolation, begets feelings of unworthiness, begets corrupted value systems, begets illusions of power, control, begets violence and destruction. It's hard to get along with some college-educated leftists who leave out humanity. Some believe that in the punitive binary, a reflection of our own destructive programming. We are messy, shitty human beings. Dirt and filth and funk between piss and shit we come. Blessing upon the world, the human soul takes flesh and funk to make. All known patterns of life in some form come from destruction, dirt, mineral heaps of all former incarnations. That's an amazing cycle in itself. Some forms of life are born and raised with the corrupted nurturing phases. We are flesh computers programmed by people who don't see the tools or the problem at hand. And if you've never considered the incalculable variables inside the patterns one could develop with the wrong nurture programs and corrupted value systems, you might not have considered the whole issue at hand. We forget they, we, you, me work inside and build lexicons of exclusion and gated access to intellectual, spiritual, and financial mobility. It's not as simple as read a book, Philistine. Never be violent and we won't end you in your career. We internalize the predatory lexicons we learn to exist inside of. Everyone needs therapy. Folks need an inventory of their actions, feelings, and relationships. People need food and water and shelter in a predatory system first. We're born with the same books or parental figures who teach through compassion and empathy. Some of us are great at performing in a system optimized for us. Doesn't mean others start on the same foot or the same platform to bop unethical or immoral animals around or impulses from inside the individual. Some got strong opinions about which fear is real and which isn't. Feeling unsafe is as serious as being born and bred into violence, where someone will literally attack you or take your life or your flesh, your blood, your future, your hopes, and your dreams. What is a threat to a child who is raised by threats? Hypervigilance on a loop in the shade of a profit-driven internment system. Some see socio-political organizing as a way to fight against those who hurt them, begin with using their hypervigilance and experience with violence as an asset, but organizing against the systems that protect abuse and violence is not always that. It's much tougher than getting even with a big pile of corrupt politicians who embody systemic violence, hierarchical abuse, destructive lexicons, and discourse. Someone has to start and proliferate radical kindness, new infrastructures and lexicons. That takes perpetual fortitude, perpetual curiosity, radical empathy, forever updating the tools in your toolbox. It takes the same humanity. Our punitive binary doesn't allow beyond reactionary discourse. You have to pull from a place so deep no one can take it from you. It's internal and exists across multiple planes, a light that turns on in a sea of nothing. Radical kindness, the smallest big bang in our everyday actions, direct actions. You have to be humble and move towards it. And none of us will ever be in a place to be the face or embodiment of kindness. There will always be a portion of us that is gross, messy, violent, and awful. Human grace is an aspiration. It's ever present, and we could all just wake up one day and become Buddha or whatever variation of your apex is on the enlightened soul chart. The world is full of distractions, though, and it keeps our minds full of faulty narratives, bad programming. When we can't be present, we're no longer in control, and then the deep behavioral patterns kick in. It'll be hard to sustain any movement without radical love, empathy, and a constant self-inventory of the ways we have been the one who hurts others. It's about building new infrastructures of inclusion and paths to rehabilitation. Breaking behavioral patterns takes more than personal work therapy and reading materials. It takes time and space, and we live in a predatory system that commodifies our time and occupancy of space through illusions of wealth and resources. We're forced to buy back our time and space when we naturally own it. The only currency or system of value a plutocrat can't take if we're organized and fortified in our mutual aid and direct action and all that other, stuff. And I've been an asshole, and I've been verbally abusive. I've had friends describe me as cold, detached, and mean. I apologize 10 trillion times over, and in my personal relationships, I've apologized. I've tucked myself away from the world because of mental health issues. The endless blue shame when you want your life to shut off. Your value of human life is distorted. Despite the mostly constructive and helpful version 98% of people know me as I've caused others to feel emotional pain. It's a heavy burden and adds to my already monumental amount of guilt I have stemming from my childhood. When you can't give people instant gratification on all levels, you're dismissed in a highly commodified information market. It's not sexy or cool to say we bring our abstractions to life. It's not empowering to acknowledge harmful abstractions have been beaten to us and we're already in pain. But we have to begin somewhere. We create through our behavioral patterns, processes, and framework we build and maintain. Life has no aim. We inject our own intent narratives in a cold universe. We support these commodified infrastructures till we don't. We support the perpetual cycles of violence till we don't. The answer to violence is not cool, swift, streamlined answer. It's not in one book or 10 books or 100 essays. It's messy and fucked up. An enigma to its user, a noxious program, a broken lexicon. A hurt animal hurting another animal in a cold universe where they're small, scared, and they have to attack, run, or think. What we do is who we are, and we can't build better worlds while consuming and using illusions of comfort that remove choice by force. Indoctrination and late-stage capitalism is psychosis. Violence is not virtuous, whether for state, country, ideology, or culture. When we want a better world, we should not ask for it. There's no one to ask. No one's in charge. We're all agents of change or aiding the force that removes the choice. On their clock or off their clock. What's given and spent is always real. And I begin my day with these questions on my own desk. How much force is needed? How much change begins with a long series of mornings like this? Prayers to the market, to God, to Alpha Authority, to Gaia, to whoever is the mirrored face, the shadow of humankind, building the invisible hand of systemic happenings. My last prayer to violence.
My last prayer to violence.